كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء، وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء، وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء، وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء، وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء، وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء، وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء، وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء، وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس، يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء، اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك، وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك، وأن توزعني شكرك، وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا، وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت طاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته، وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك، وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك، وغلب قهرك وجرأت قدرتك، ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا، ولا لقبائحي ساترا، ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته، وكم من فادح من البلاء أقلته، وكم من عثار وقيته، وكم من مكروه دفعته، وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي، وقصرت بي أعمالي، وقعدت بي أغلالي، وحبسني عن نفعي بعد أملي، وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها، ونفسي بخيانتها، ومطالي يا سيدي. فأسألك بعزتك أن لا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي، ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري، ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي. وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي، وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي، أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك، وخالفت بعض أوامرك، فلك الحمد علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك. وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك، وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا، مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا، لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري، غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري، وارحم شدة ضري، وفكني من شد وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، ورقة جلدي، ودقة عظمي، يا من بدا خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي. هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالفي برك بي، يا إلهي وسيدي وربي. أتراك معذب عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك. وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك، هيهات أنت أكرم أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تبعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدا، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقا، وبشكرك مادحا، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققا، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنا. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم. يا ربي وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثه، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه، ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك. وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض يا سيدي، فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الدليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها ضج وأبكي؟ لأليم العذاب وشدته، أم لطول البلاء ومدته؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجائي عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، إن تركتني ناطقا لأضجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآملين، ولا أصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين أنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته، وذاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك يا مولاي. فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا رباه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات، ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عاملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك، فباليقين يقطع لولا حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك، وقضيت به من إخلاد معانديك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كان لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما، لكنك تقدست أسماؤك، أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين. وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا، وتطولت بالإنعام متكرما. أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها، وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته، وكل ذنب أذنبته، وكل قبيح أسررته، وكل جهل عملته، كتمته أو أعلنته، أخفيته أو أظهرته، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني، وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم، والشاهد لما خفي عنهم برحمتك وأخفيته، وبفضلك سترته، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته، أو إحسان فضلته، أو بر نشرته، أو رزق بسطته، أو ذنب تغفره، أو خطأ تستره. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. أسألك بحقك وقدسك وأعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي في الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة، وبخدمتك موصولة، وأعمالي عندك مقبولة، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي، يا من عليه معولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، قو على خدمتك جوارحي، واشدد على العزيمة جوانحي، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك، والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك، حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، وأسرع إليك في البارزين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فارد، ومن كادني فكد، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك وأقربهم منزلة منك وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك، وجد لي بجودك، وأعطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأقلني عثرتي، واغفر زلتي، فإن قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة، فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي، وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني مناي، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي، يا سريع الرضا، اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء، يا من اسمه دواء، وذكره شفاء، وطاعته غنى، وارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء، وسلاحه البكاء، يا سابق النعم، يا دافع النقام، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله، وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله، وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أفلح من قرأ سورة الفاتحة.
ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد، والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, scholars, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When we refer to the Holy Quran, there's a very interesting discussion where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through a number of different verses, speaks about how we as human beings can develop happiness within our lives. And what actions or what principles, if we were to observe them within our lives, would attract displeasure, would attract sorrow and grief that we often see. One of the things that we've made ourselves to realize or even believe is that many a times when we see certain bala and imtihanat within our lives, it is because of the external factors that we are surrounded by. So there are often certain things that happen which is not within our powers, somehow manage to enter our lives which then causes grief and sorrow within our hearts. And likewise happiness. Whereas when you refer to the Holy Quran, you'll find that there are certain ayats where Allah creates a direct relationship between how a person, if he was to move away from developing a relationship with Allah, grief and sorrow would naturally enter his life. Or if a person was to develop a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he would naturally become happy. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'll share some of these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly tells us that it's not because of the external factors that makes a person unhappy or happy, rather it is our own actions, based on our own decisions and free will, that when we perform them, that is what attracts happiness or displeasure or sorrow within our lives. Very interestingly, when you look at how communities are built up or how societies are framed and constructed, if you have people or members within the community or society who are trustworthy, who constantly say the truth, as in imagine a scenario where verbal agreements hold weight, that if a person promises something to you, something quite significant, he has vowed to adhere to the contracts and the stipulations verbally, you not need to worry about anything later on. That maybe later on in the future, there is no worry in your heart that he will move away from that contract. As in imagine a scenario where everyone is trustworthy, everyone is truthful, everyone understands that they are held accountable for their own actions and their own decisions, where there is security in a community, security physically, security emotionally, psychologically. You know that your dear brother thinks good of you and you think good of them. That if your name is mentioned in a third-party conversation, you would defend them and you would honor them. Imagine a community where people are generous, people are altruistic. You find that naturally such a community would be strong from the roots. That there is no worry that would enter the hearts of the people would naturally be happy. And this is all based on one's own personal actions. It's not based on external factors that enter a person's life. Likewise, on the flip side, if you have a community that is based on dishonesty, where people from time to time lie, where, for example, people do not hold value, and some of the most important values that we understand in the religion of Islam is the family or the values of family, to preserve the nuclear family. Nowadays, for example, if we hear certain divorces take place in the community, it's become normalized. There is a rising number of divorces. Qat'iyat al-rahim is now part and parcel of society, not just within our community, but within the broader society, within the secular society as well, where children are very much willing to break off connections from their parents. Islam demands that you develop that relationship with your parents, with your siblings. Even if garbage is thrown at you, at least you should reciprocate with kindness. Because ultimately, kindness at the end of the day always softens the heart. And look at Rasulullah and look how he was able to nurture an entire community within a span of 23 years. He was able to attract them because of his mercy and his kindness. Kindness is never disregarded. It always softens the heart. The power of kindness and good akhlaq is, it softens the heart with the people you interact with. Ultimately, when you find a community that is based on dishonesty, where people vilify each other, where people, for example, degrade each other, you find that naturally the roots of that community or that society begins to weaken until the entire community collapses. Nowadays, one of the models that people live by is the model of individualism. That you should only live your life based on your own welfare and your own interest. Others in your life have no priority whatsoever. The problem here is that we're not created to be individuals or to live as individuals. We're created to be a part of a society. And if we were to help each other, create that deep love and affection for each other, where we support each other, look after each other, we defend each other, that's when true happiness resonates within the heart of the human being. We are not created to live as isolated from one another. We don't believe in the whole concept of individualism. Ultimately, our actions has an effect on how happy we are or how happy we become, and likewise how grief and sorrow enters our heart. It is all affected based on the actions that we perform. So if we observe, for example, naturally when you observe the lives of certain individuals, you find that there are people who are more happier than others, and likewise there are others who are more sadder or more in the state of grief than others. Where do we extract happiness from? How do we attain happiness within our lives? Now the Quran is very cut clear in this particular position. The Quran mentions that happiness is something that cannot be attained or extracted from the material world. Because the material world does not have the capacity or the ability to give that to the human being. In essence, the material world does not have the ability to make a person happy. So someone may believe, for example, that happiness stems from having a lavish house, or having a lavish car, or wearing lavish clothes, and so on and so forth. These are the standards of how happy a person is. Unfortunately, this is how, and this is what we see, especially on social media. A person who believes in this, that through materialism and acquiring vast resources is the formula to happiness, unfortunately, you'll find that the person has lied to himself. He has developed a false belief within his own heart. In fact, he's lied to himself so much so that he believes it to be true. The Quran tells us something very different. That, for example, a person could be a king, he may have everything in his hands, yet he may not be happy. Likewise, we can see that there are certain individuals in certain areas of the world who have very little resources, very basic resources that they live by. Yet they are very happy and they are very content. When we look at the world, one of the essence of the features of the world is that it is imperfect. When you refer, for example, to Nahj al-Balagha, when you refer to the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, how he dissociates himself from the world. The world in itself is imperfect. If the world is imperfect, then how can we try and acquire perfection from it? In essence, it cannot give perfection to the human being. Why? Because in itself, it's imperfect. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, coming back to our discussion regarding Surah Al-Yasin. Now, so far, we've discussed how the three messengers, the disciples of Nabi Allah Isa, came towards the people of Antioch. They confronted the rulers of Antioch. The rulers of Antioch presented three arguments. We looked into those three arguments and how futile these arguments were in the face of these messengers. To the extent that when they stood defenseless, unable to argue any further, they then presented a threat. لَنَرْجُمَنَّكُمْ وَلَيَمَسَّنَّكُمْ مِنَّا عَذَابٌ عَلِيمٌ. We will engage in rajam. And we looked at the two meanings of rajam. The meaning of rajam was either to stone a person until they are killed, or the second meaning was character assassination. That rather than killing you, we will go around to the people of the community, especially those who have a lenient heart towards you, and we will cause distrust in their hearts towards you. We will vilify you, degrade your name. We will allow the people to lose their trust in you. And we said that this is a clearer meaning, or this is the more preferable meaning. The reason being is because after the first threat, they present the second threat, which is وَلَا يَمَسَّنَّكُمْ مِنَّا عَذَابٌ عَلِيمٌ. We will punish you with a very painful punishment. Well, if you're going to present the punishment of stoning a person to death, then why would you present a second punishment, which is to inflict pain? So we said that rajam does not necessarily mean to stone a person to death, but rather to destroy their entire character. وَلَا يَمَسَّنَّكُمْ مِنَّا عَذَابٌ عَلِيمٌ. عَذَابٌ عَلِيمٌ is a very painful punishment that is projected to the individual. Now, this form of punishment can manifest itself either physically or emotionally or psychologically. Here, the Mufassirin incline towards the physical aspect of the punishment, because rajam, character assassination, is more of an emotional, psychological punishment, where your name is absolutely destroyed. So because that's from the psychological, emotional perspective, adhabun alim in this particular verse is in reference specifically to physical punishment. A question arises, why did they not think about just imprisoning these individuals? Isolate them from the rest of the community. Lock them behind bars so they have no interaction with the outside community. That's a viable option. But why did they not mention that option within this? Why did they not think about it for Allah to mention it within this verse? Well, if you look at the nature of imprisonment, imprisonment does not work for the Anbiya. It does not work for the Rusul. It does not even work for the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. It's been tried and it's been tested. The whole idea of prison is to isolate a person from society. When you're isolated from communication with the outside world, you're isolated, for example, there is a distance between you and, for example, the resources that you can enjoy from. The clothes that you wear is very limited. The food that you eat is very controlled. You can't engage in the natural pleasures in prison as if you were outside of prison. That's still a very effective punishment. But why didn't they think of it? Because it doesn't work for the divine messengers. You look at the example of Imam Kadhim alayhi salatu wasalam. Imam al-Kadhim was a threat towards Harun al-Rashid. Harun thinks of the option of imprisoning the Imam, and that's exactly what he does. He takes the Imam, locks him behind bars for a good number of years, a good portion of the life of Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, he was behind bars. He was in prison. Yet he found, you see, Harun al-Rashid had a problem, political problem. His rivalry was Imam Kadhim alayhi salam. And he saw that the people were now following the Imam, or the numbers of his followers were rising. So he takes the Imam and he isolates them from his followers, from his Shia. When he imprisons him, his idea was that not because he is separated from his people, naturally their followers or his followers will decline. But he saw the opposite taking place. More and more followers began to follow Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. It was the direct opposite of what he had imagined. In fact, the wardens and the officers that used to look after Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam were so affected by him that Harun was forced to transfer him from one prison to another. You know what's very interesting within the discussion of imamah is to understand the responsibility of the imam. The imams, the prophets, the anbiya, the rusul, they all have one responsibility, which is to understand and to present the message of Islam, to preserve the message of Islam. The Ahl al-Bayt were the guardians of the message of Rasulullah. That was their responsibility, but that responsibility manifested in different ways. You look at Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, his observance of patience was a manifestation of guarding the message of Rasulullah. Imam Hassan, peace be to him. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Karbala. Imam al-Sajjad through du'as. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam was the building of the university. Imam al-Kadhim, even though he was in prison, that responsibility is still there on his shoulders. Never once did he sit back and say, look, I'm isolated from the rest of my community, therefore naturally I'm absolved of this responsibility. He molded his environment in such a way that he was able to nurture and to adhere to his responsibilities. Even if it affected one individual, two individuals, a handful of individuals, he still maintained that responsibility he was endowed with by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To the extent that it worked. Even though Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam was in prison, isolated from the rest of society, people were still naturally affected by him and his teachings. It worked. And the evidence of this is that Harun actively poisoned the Imam in prison. As in, if you have a king who has taken his rivalry, has taken his enemy and has imprisoned him, what threat does the enemy pose, or what threat does the king's enemy pose towards the king? It was a threat to Harun. And Harun actively killed the Imam alayhi salam. When you look at the story of Nabi Allah Yusuf alayhi salam, when Yusuf is imprisoned, he is found guilty for an act that he did not commit, for a crime that he did not commit. He turns to Allah, he says, Ya Allah, قَالَ رَبِّ السِّجْنُ أَحُبُّ إِلَيَّ. It is more preferable for me. I love it more مِمَّا يَدْعُونَنِي إِلَيْهِ. It's more loved in comparison to all of the things that the people are saying about me. I'd rather be in a position where I am isolated from the rest of the community. And he himself, with his responsibility, was able to nurture and guide with the companions that he had within the prisons. Prison does not work for the Anbiya or the Rasul. Now you could say, the conclusion of this, you could say that the people of Antioch, the rulers of Antioch understood this. They understood the ability and the power of these three messengers, and they knew and concluded that prison may not be the best option for them. Because even though they may be locked away, they may still be able to enhance and affect the community. The reply that the messengers gave after being threatened is also very interesting. قَالُوا طَائِرُكُمْ مَعَكُمْ. These superstitions and these bad omens that you believe, it's not because of the external factors in your life. It's because of your own actions. It stems from your kufr. It stems from the bad actions that you perform. The two go hand in hand. When a person has been presented with the belief or with the religion of Islam, the message of Islam, they have the choice to accept or to reject. Alongside it is the actions that they perform. From amongst the actions that they would perform was the actions of oppression and injustice. The evidence of this is لَنَرْجُمَنَّكُمْ وَلَيَمَسَّنَّكُمْ مِنَّا عَذَابٌ عَلِيمٌ. When they stood defenseless, unable to argue any more or any longer, the natural response that they had was, we will punish you and we will kill you. So the reply that came from the messengers was, these superstitions and these bad omens that you point fingers towards us and say that we are the cause for them. What were the bad omens? We know from the narrations that rain had stopped. So the drought had expanded within the region. Illnesses and diseases, leprosy spread amongst the people. There was fraction and disunity within the community, and that's always bad for a leader. So all of these things were now being manifest. These rulers turned to the messengers and they started blaming the messengers. It's because that you entered the city that now we are seeing all of the evils that we see today. So no, these superstitions or these bad effects that you see around you is because of your kufr, it's because of your own bad actions. Take responsibility. Do not turn to other people and blame other people for the evil that you see within your own life. It's very important. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Beyond that, very interestingly, he says, or they say to him, بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُصْرِفُونَ. Because you are individuals who actively engage in israf, for that reason you can see all of the evils that exist around you. Israf is when a person lives beyond his means. There is extravagance that takes place within a person's life. There's a very interesting narration from Asbagh ibn Nabata who relates from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala. The Imam says, Alamatul Musrif thalatha. He says the indication of the Musrif is three. When a person eats what does not belong to him, when a person wears an attire or clothes that does not belong to him, and when a person buys something that does not belong to him. Now what the examination or the explanation of this narration is for a different time, inshallah. There are three different distinct interpretations to this particular hadith, and from which perspective they approach to understand what the Imam is trying to say. But what we could say is that the Imam is presenting a very powerful philosophy, and it can manifest itself in a variation of different ways. From amongst them, a person could live beyond his own means. A person, for example, violates human values. Innately, fitratan, we have rahmah, we have kindness and affection that is directed towards the orphans. But then you have certain individuals who eat from the wealth, the amwal of the orphans. Again, that's one of the manifestations of israf. When a person actively engages in taking someone's property, becomes a ghasib, that's one of the manifestations of israf. When a person squanders the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when a person actively engages in a sin, again, these are different manifestations of israf. When the messengers turned to the rulers of Antioch and said, بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُصْرِفُونَ, the ayah doesn't say that your actions are actions of israf. You, as human beings, are musrifun. That you have molded yourself, you have characterized yourself as israf or with israf to such an extent that it's become part and parcel of your own nature. It's become a habit for you to act in this particular way. This is the oppression that you have committed for this evil to now come towards you. The messengers we're now creating a very powerful relationship that when a person engages in israf, they will by necessity see the evils enter within their lives. Evil is not an external factor that enters a person's life. It is because of their own actions. If the actions is based on kufr and it is based on unrighteous actions, then naturally that will attract evil within a person's life. The solution to this, very interestingly, Allah says that if a person truly wants to become happy, he shouldn't turn towards the physical world, but rather he should turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the greatest manifestations of how a person can attract happiness within his life is through the remembrance of Allah. Dhikrullah, it's a very powerful concept that has the ability to monitor our own actions. If a person is on the verge of committing a sin, and the thought of Allah enters his mind, if the person is principled and disciplined, then he will move away from that particular action. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكَ. Allah says that if a person was to disengage with my remembrance, he moved away from my remembrance, then he will live a life of dhanka. What's dhanka? Dhanka meaning when life becomes very narrow. You know when a person gives you a hug and they squeeze you, it affects your breathing, doesn't it? It makes you breathe harder. You're struggling to breathe. You could still be living in that state, but breathing becomes harder for you. That's the state of dhanka. Allah says that if a person disengages in his remembrance, if Allah is no longer part and parcel of your life, you would still be alive, but your life would be a struggle. You would be suffering because there is grief and sorrow constantly that resonates within the heart. Now I understand that there are many individuals in this community who are heading off to Hajj. And we are now entering the season of Hajj, the month of the Hijjah, considered to be one of the 4 sacred months within the Islamic traditions and narrations. May Allah bless you and your families, inshaAllah. May Allah allow you to understand how profound Hajj is, for it to have an effect on your life that you're able to understand how to live your lives when you return back, inshaAllah. There is a couple of narrations I would like to share. Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, he mentions, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He says the profundity of Hajj can manifest itself in such a way that if a person was to enter Hajj and complete Hajj, if he was to turn to Allah and ask for whatever he desired, Allah would grant it to him. He said if a person was to intercede on behalf of others, Allah would grant that for him as well. He says if a person remains quiet, Allah will speak to the individual. He says if a person spends however wealth or however much he spends to go for Hajj, Allah will return 1,000,000 in return. In a different narration, very interestingly, you know when we speak about finances and going for Hajj today, nowadays it's very, very expensive. Pre-COVID it was one price and all of a sudden it's doubled the price after COVID. You know, I've never witnessed a person who has gone for Hajj for him to return and to be in financial distress. That's something that we need to recognize as well. Never be pushed away because of the price tag of Hajj. I have never come across a person who has gone for Hajj and has come back and is in financial difficulty. In a separate narration, Imam alayhi salam mentions that there are 3 types of people. When they come back from Hajj, they either belong to one of these 3 categories. He says the first one, by necessity, the person is freed from the fire. He says the second group, he says their sins are forgiven as if they have been reborn. He says as for the third, at least for these individuals, his wealth and his family is guarded, they're protected. Now it doesn't mean that all 3 cannot manifest into a single individual, but at least some of these will be, or some of these favors will be directed towards the Hujjaj. But if we will refer to the hadith of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. In Risalat al-Hukuk, the words that he shares with regards to Hajj, it's profound. He says, وَأَمَّا حَقُّ الْحَجِّ عَلَيْكَ أن تعلم أنه وفادة إلى ربك. He says if a person was to understand what Hajj is, he says Hajj is wifada ila rabbik. Wifada, what's the meaning of wifada? Wufud. Wufud is when a person enters the presence of someone who has authority. It could be a king, it could be a very affluent individual. You want to seek a loan from him. You know that he has the power to give you the wealth that you're seeking for. By entering his presence, there is that sense of humility. There is that sense of understanding the authority of whom you're entering the presence of. Wifada is when you enter the presence of someone who has authority. But beyond that, you want to seek something from them. So by necessity, when you enter their presence, you're entering with a specific style, with great humility, with great humbleness. It says, وَفِرَارٌ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ ذُنُوبِكَ. Hajj by necessity is something where a person sees escape from his sins. You know, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam has an interesting hadith in this regards. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He says, like cattle, the Hujjaj will go towards the Bayt Allah. Like birds, they will passionately fly towards the a'mal, the manasik of Hajj. He says, Allah has made Hajj the way it is because it shows the manifestations of humility. By going for Hajj and engaging in all of the different a'mal, you engrave within your heart what your relationship is with Allah. And our relationship with Allah is the relationship of a slave in front of his master. That's why the Imam alayhi salam says, wifadatun ila rabbik, towards your Lord. Lord meaning what? What does Rabb mean? Rabb means a person who controls every affair of your life. Every aspect of your life, from your wealth, through your health, your children, your wives, all of these affairs is controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you understand that there is a greater power who has this ability to decide and control all of your affairs, naturally our response and our interactions change. It becomes an interaction of humility. So the first holy Imam alayhi salam, he says that they enter towards Hajj like cattle. They passionately fly towards Hajj like birds because it instills humility within their hearts. It makes them understand the true position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَفِرَارٌ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ ذُنُوبِكَ. You know, we have this in our societies as well. Many of us engage in this. When we are in a routine, day in, day out, for months, we need a break. So we go for a break. We go for a couple of weeks here and there. We enjoy ourselves. We break that routine, we come back. Sometimes the effects of sins on our lives are so overburdening. We recognize the burdens of our sins, and the only escape that comes into mind is to go for Hajj. Hajj becomes an escape. It's where a person refreshes, he absolves himself from all of the sins and the effects of his sins. When he comes back anew. The sanctity of Hajj, Abi Abdullah alayhi salam understood that it has to be preserved. But when he knew the intentions of his enemies, he said that they do not hold Hajj with such sanctity. There's no respect towards Hajj in their eyes. If I was within the Masjid al-Haram, they would enter it and they would slaughter me and my family. So he converts his Hajj towards Umrah and then he leaves. He leaves and he progresses towards Kufa. Just as how the Bani Umayyah had no sanctity towards Masjid al-Haram and the manasik of Hajj, they had no sanctity towards the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam. Abu Hamza al-Thumali, he enters the presence of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. Imam al-Sajjad is crying and he's weeping. And then the Imam says to Abu Hamza says to him, Sayyidi, why do you cry? Ma hadha al-buka. Why do you cry so much? Karbala has taken place many years prior. Al-katlu lakum aada. And your family, your grandfather, your father, your uncle, all of them have met the end of the sword. Murder is normal within your family. Wa karamatkum min Allahi shahada. Allah has blessed you with shahada. Why do you cry? The Imam responds, Shakar Allahu laka ya Aba Hamza. When Yusuf was taken away from Ya'qub, Ya'qub cried and cried. until he went blind, and he knew that Yusuf was alive. Ya Aba Hamza, on the day of Ashura, I saw 17, 18 members of my family slaughtered before me. And then he says, Ya Aba Hamza, هل سبي النساء لنا عادة? When our women were taken as prisoners, tell me, was this a norm in our family? Ya Aba Hamza, والله ما نظرت إلى عماتي وأخواتي إلا ذكرت فرارهن يوم عاشوراء. Whenever I see my aunts and my sisters, all I could think of what happened is of what happened on the day of Ashura. فرارهن يوم عاشوراء من خيمة إلى خيمة حتى ينادي المنادي احرقوا بيوت الظالمين. When I saw them running, escaping from the fires, running from one tent towards another, until a man, a caller, made a call, burn the tents of Ali Muhammad. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. If we can recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all our marhumin, inshallah. رحم الله من قرأ Surah Al-Fatiha.
وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك وجعلنا من أعوانك والأنصارك والمستشهدين بين يديك. السلام عليكم.